Our next speaker is Paul Fitzgerald. Paul is an author and researcher known for his work on deep politics, covert power, and the hidden forces that shape our world events. In today's presentation, Dr. John D., Queen Elizabeth I's master spy 007 and wizard behind the JFK assassination, Paul will take us on a journey that spans continents and centuries. He traces the lineage of British intelligence back to Dr. John D., scholar, cryptographer, astrologer, advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, and the original 007. Paul explores how D's intelligence apparatus laid the foundation for the geopolitical power structures that evolved into the Anglo-American intelligence alliance that we know today. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Paul Fitzgerald.
So a lot of the things that Chris was saying in his presentation kind of rhyme with what we're doing and have been doing for some time. And it all came about as a result of our work in Afghanistan, because we realized that there was a whole other story behind the story. And when you get into Afghanistan, you get into the British Empire, you get into the background of the secret societies. I mean, after the CIA was built in the 1950s, they came in, the head of British intelligence came in and he said, this looks exactly like what we intended in India. What you did was you made it real. So what we're doing is that we're looking at all these aspects of the JFK assassination, and we're trying to say, well, where does this fit? Where does that fit? Where does that fit? And so we came to a conclusion, and that's what I want to present to you tonight. So the last time I addressed the Dallas conference was in 2023. I spoke of the esoteric background surrounding John Fitzgerald Kennedy's Fitzgerald family history and how JFK could have been sacrificed in the tradition of the Anglo-Saxon Archbishop Thomas Becket in 1170. Since then, I'd felt compelled to dive deeper into the historical record, not expecting to discover connections to the Knights Templar, the origins of Freemasonry, something called the externalization of the hierarchy, and the meaning behind the rebuilding of Solomon's Temple. In other words, no Sam Giancana, no Fidel Castro or Marilyn Monroe, just Queen Elizabeth I and her secret agent 007, John D., the Renaissance magician who stood at the foundation of modern science, who's been called upon in January of 1559 to cast an emergency horoscope for Elizabeth's coronation in order to prevent the dire prophecies of the French Catholic prophet Nostradamus from taking hold. And why was calculating a horoscope seen as so important, even after the date had been approved by Queen Elizabeth's closest advisors? John D's expert and author Jason Louv writes, quote, astrology, like sorcery, is about defining the narrative of reality. Considering astrology even from a purely propaganda angle, the power to guide reality in any other way than that sanctioned by the state is a precarious business, especially when prophecies have a way of becoming self-fulfilling. Magicians, astrologers, and prophets have often appeared to have changed objective reality. All that's truly changed is the subjective way in which events are being perceived, a skillful manipulation of confirmation bias. Aside from the fact that Elizabethan-era conjurers, both Protestant and Catholic, used assassination as a tool of prophecy, Dee was onto techniques that many other 16th century natural scientists were getting burned at the stake for. But I never considered he had anything to do with JFK until I followed Louv's argument to its logical conclusion. To paraphrase Louv, if the American empire is the logical successor to the British, then we must hold that John Dee is the great-grandparent of the modern world order, ruled by a bureaucratic managerial class, united under the banner of Protestantism's conquering child, the single world religion of global capitalism, yet with the exact same Protestant eschatology operating in the background. John Dee was obsessed with eschatology, namely the doctrine of last things, originally Western in nature, referring to Jewish, Christian, and Muslim beliefs about the end of history, the resurrection of the dead, last judgment, and the problem of theodicy, the vindication of God's justice. And if such is the plan, maintained by secret societies fulfilling a long-term prophecy of rebuilding the Temple of King Solomon, then how can we view the assassination of JFK, his brother, and his son as anything other than a cosmically connected eschatological process, the result of which we are now living out on a daily basis? To add authenticity, the motive to begin this deep dive into the family connection came from my 10-year-old daughter in a dream she'd had with my deceased father back in 1991, accompanied by a man dressed in a funny golf hat and matching bell-bottom tartan uniform, who told her he was 800 years old. Not being one to ignore a message from the grave, I began to consider what this might mean and started paying a lot more attention to dreams. Although dismissed for centuries, in this age of neural networks, digital IDs, it's been recognized that John Dee's active use of what's now called cosmopolitics, a mix of physics, geography, astronomy, and astrology, has as much to do with the creation of British and American policy in the 20th century as it did in the 16th, especially as it applies to the death and life of JFK and his family. According to Professor Deborah E. Harkness's John Dee's Conversation with Angels, quote, Dee was steadily working at nothing less than a new geopolitical ordering for the entire planet, with Elizabeth I as the terrestrial and spiritual emperor of all mankind, with a new and all-uniting religious dispensation to be given to the world by the angels, which would bring under its fold not only the warring factions of Christendom, but also Judaism and Islam, and return fallen humanity to the original divine plan. When our publisher, Chris Milligan, first asked for a third book to our Valediction memoir series after delivering that Dallas speech in 2023, I knew I'd have to break new ground. Our first two books were about the trials and tribulations we'd lived through as journalists, unraveling the mysteries surrounding the 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. How could a country of fourth-rate importance that the United States had always considered within the Soviet sphere of influence suddenly become the greatest threat to peace since World War II? And all of this under the watchful eye of Carter's anti-Soviet hawk, Zbigniew Brzezinski. After our first trip there in 1981 for CBS News, we'd invited Harvard Negotiation Project Director and Getting to Yes author Roger Fisher to return with us and discovered the Soviets knew they'd made a terrible mistake, but the Reagan administration was keeping them trapped. By accident, we'd found ourselves in a feudal holy war with the Soviet Union that drew parallels to the Crusades and the CIA as the Knights Templar. So what does one do about that? When I first considered writing a memoir with my wife Liz about the experience, my mind kept going back to one question Roger had asked me after spending a few days with us in Kabul in the spring of 1983. How do you know how to do this? Coming out of the blue, there was something about Roger's question that didn't make sense until I realized he'd been over to the U.S. Embassy and apparently cross-examined about my objectives by Charlie Dunbar, the acting man in charge. It turned out that Dunbar, the diplomat, was soon to leave Kabul for Pakistan to become Dunbar, the pitchman, for the Saudi Arabian-financed Afghan holy warriors as a legitimate political force, while helping them enhance their international political standing. I already considered the American government's plan reckless for empowering 7 different brands of religious extremism. Before the Cold War hit Kabul in 1978, Afghanistan had been a modernizing influence on the Muslim world, freeing its population, and especially its women, from the depredations of British colonialism. We knew the day would come when the U.S. would pay for creating a holy jihad, but I had yet to discover there was a long-held objective beneath the surface that tied the whole crazy plot together. When we started out to research the Fitzgerald family, we'd already left the world of mainstream media behind. But our daughter's dream with my father and the 800-year-old man forced us to look at the experience in Afghanistan in a very different way. It wasn't until I started writing screenplays that I began to understand the hidden or occult aspects of narrative creation. Much is involved in the process of converting a mental image to the screen, with both linguistic and numerical. This focus on number led me back to the Renaissance Neoplatonist Dr. John Dee, Queen Elizabeth's magician spy. During Dee's era, mathematics was considered a form of magic and mathematicians sorcerers. In his mathematic preface to Euclid, Dee argued that numbers participated in everything from the divine to the mundane, and that since God's numbering of things was also his creation of all things, he could conceivably control the numbering process by withdrawing a thing's number entirely. It's now accepted that Dee was way ahead of his time, and that his application of a little understood technique known as cosmopolitics that enabled him to predict political events and their location in the future would anticipate GPS tracking by 400 years. According to author Francis Yates, Renaissance Neoplatonists believed that all knowledge, including mathematics, descended from the Creator through the angels in the intellectual world, to the stars in the celestial world, and then to all things in the terrestrial world, and that remains of ancient cities, columns, and pyramids were evidence of past use of mathematical magic. But not until I did a deep dive into my own family's history in Ireland did I discover how I'd stumbled on a numerical process connecting JFK's ancestors with John Dee's calculations regarding the date, November 22nd, 1583. As the children of the 12th century Welsh Princess Nest and Gerald the Constable of Windsor, the sons of Gerald had participated in the creation of a feudal Anglo-Norman empire which still dominates British politics behind the scenes. But when I discovered that Nest and Gerald named their firstborn son William Fitzgerald, the name of my own father, and his grandfather and great-grandfather before him, I got curious. And when I found that Dee had traced the same ancestry for Queen Elizabeth I and himself, and used it to justify her claims to a global empire, it became too much to ignore. After arriving in Ireland in 1170, the Fitzgeralds soon divided into the two houses known as Kildare and Desmond, and feuded relentlessly with the Butlers, their next-door neighbors and Earls of Ormond. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, by the first half of the 15th century, Ireland was ruled by the three great earls, Desmond, Ormond, and Kildare. They'd established relations with the noble families of Europe, sided with the Yorkist King Edward IV in the War of the Roses, 1455 to 1487, and become deeply enmeshed in royal intrigues. Newly discovered document reveals that direct involvement in the transfer of power from Richard III to the Tudor Henry VII, which would explode into open warfare under Henry VIII and his daughter Elizabeth I. Henry's rule brought on the Protestant Reformation, the dissolution of the monasteries, and the destruction of the clans. His 6 wives were the stuff of scandal, and his struggles with his Catholic chancellor Thomas More, whom he beheaded in 1535, legendary. But to the Fitzgeralds, there would be only one rule and one religion in Ireland. And with the coming of Henry's daughter, Elizabeth, the family feud would become the model for a war of sacred imperialism, intended to restore an imagined golden age of peace and prosperity. Dee's idea was to use Solomonic theurgic magic to establish Queen Elizabeth as more than just the Judeo-Christian Queen of England, but to elevate her to a sacred place in the cosmic hierarchy under God as the messianic ruler of the material world. Solomonic theurgy provided the techniques and the tools to make this possible by summoning King Solomon's angels while using the geometric dimensions of Solomon's temple as the sacred place in which to do it. Frances Yates describes it in her 1979 masterpiece, The Occult Philosophy in the Elizabethan Age. Quote, Dee's views on the British imperial destiny of Queen Elizabeth I are set out in his general and rare memorials pertaining to the perfect art of navigation, 1577. Elizabethan expansion at sea was connected in his mind with vast ideas concerning the lands to which Elizabeth might lay claim through her mythical descent from King Arthur. Dee's British imperialism is bound up with the British history recounted by Geoffrey of Monmouth, based on the hypothetical descent of British monarchy from Brute, supposedly of Trojan origin, and therefore connecting with Virgil and the Roman imperial myth. Arthur was supposedly a descendant of Brute and was the chief religious and mystical exemplar of sacred British imperial Christianity. In a 1994 analysis of Elizabethan policy, the CIA cited Dee's Perfect Art of Navigation as the earliest instance of research intelligence at work behind covert action that compared Elizabethan agency to an occult Cold War, which established the standards and practices later used by Britain and the United States against the Soviet Union. But by far more complex than simply research intelligence. Dee's Perfect Art of Navigation stands as the esoteric blueprint and raison d'etre behind the reason and creation of the British Empire, as well as establishing the eschatological mission of that empire, in which JFK's Fitzgerald family becomes a prime ingredient. The story, as told by Richard Burleth, reads like an epic novel. Quote, Gerald, the 14th Earl of Desmond, claimed more than 800,000 acres of Southern Ireland, 1,550 square miles. His domains far exceeded those of any English lord and were largely outside their surveillance of the crown, which received virtually nothing from Gerald. Money that might have gone to defray the cost of government went instead to pay Gerald's private armies, who broke more laws than they ever enforced. For the crown, Gerald presented a formidable challenge, and the temptation was there from the start to remove him entirely. That opportunity came in the spring of 1565, when Gerald again came to blows with his nemesis, next-door neighbor and stepson, Black Tom, Butler, and the Earl of Ormond. In the last pitched battle in the British Isles, Gerald found himself shot through the hip and abandoned on the battlefield. Taken to London and imprisoned in the Tower, the last Earl of Desmond would not see Ireland again for 7 years. But one last step was needed to frame him as an enemy of the state, and so the dirty trick was hatched. In 1568, Gerald was suddenly given the liberty of the waterfront and by no coincidence crossed paths with a rapacious pirate sea captain who could smuggle him back to Ireland named Martin Frobisher. And thus came the offer of escape that would seal Gerald's fate. Burleth writes, before Frobisher had consented to play Judas, the crown had already decided its course in Ireland, and the Earl was the necessary sacrifice to the success of the new policy. I never had cause to link the 1963 assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy to the sacrifice of his 16th century ancestor, Gerald Fitzgerald. But when I discovered that both Dee and Frobisher were well known for conjuring together, and that Dee's Gregorian calendar recalculation had altered the dating of Gerald's beheading from November 11th to November 22nd, 1583, I began to see JFK's assassination as an act of ritual vengeance to eliminate his family line that had been in the work for 400 years. Dee and his circle believed magical practices could not only overcome the influence of the Roman Church in Ireland, but through the use of mathematical magic, acquire a more accurate measure of time to govern prophecy and thereby control the future. According to Harkness, quote, when Dee began contacting the angels around 1569, European scholars and theologians believed they were caught up in the midst of cosmic events prophesied in the Bible's book of Revelation. But in reality, whatever their laments were for the heavens, which were actually due to mathematical errors in the Julian calendar, their solution was not to come from God, but by eradicating the Irish Catholic population of Gerald's province of Desmond and planting a purely English colony in its place. But as the moment approached for that prophecy to come true, the war being waged to deliver it was being lost. Left in the hands of Gerald's cousin, James Fitzmaurice Fitzgerald, who transformed the confrontation into a holy war, by 1573, the tide had turned to the Earl's favor. Despite the fact that Gerald had been stripped of power after 5 years of war, the Queen had had enough. So by August of 1574, she surrendered to reality and on September 7th, fully restored Gerald to his hereditary rights. But as Gerald resumed his life as Lord of the South and consistently ignored Elizabeth's demands, the mood quickly built for an apocalyptic confrontation, and in 1579, Gerald's cousin, James Fitzmaurice, brought it home. The first Desmond Rebellion had ended in compromise, but few of the underlying causes had been resolved, and especially the final question of who would rule the south of Ireland. Fitzmaurice's return from Europe that summer with an army of Spanish and Italians and a papal nuncio armed with the just war doctrine settled the question. Fitzmaurice had brought the dialectic of the Counter-Reformation to Ireland, and the apocalyptic world-ending event lobbied for by John Dee was about to begin. I'd first come across the concept of just war in the summer of 1980 in a Foreign Policy magazine article as a justification for using nuclear weapons in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. But when I found that the doctrine had once been used on behalf of the Fitzgerald family in their response to an English genocide, the assassination of JFK became something else. Until I started my Valediction research, I hadn't known the Roman Catholic Church had begun as the Roman Imperial Church on February 27th, 380 AD, and that imperialism was a sacred grant bestowed by God. That imperial church had gifted the Knights Templar the right to murder anyone they defined as evil and had blessed that murder as sacred. But to me, resurrecting a medieval papal doctrine of just war to justify a nuclear holocaust amounted to self-annihilation. And so I found myself looking to John Dee for answers. By the late 1570s, Dee considered himself an initiate of cosmopolitical mysteries, and that's a quote. It was active converting those mysteries into political reality. He considered his timing propitious, given the upcoming shift of the great age from Venus to Jupiter, and that he'd become a master adept by completing the required 7 sevens, having reached the age of 49. But it was in his practice of calendar reform that he demonstrated the most practical use of angelic mathematical magic. And it's this mathematical magic that could have been used to prophesy the date of the Earl of Desmond's death in November 1583, and subsequently repeated for his descendant, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, through the angelic number 380 years later to the day in 1963. The Second Desmond War did not turn out as the first. Forced to lead the rebellion after Fitzmaurice was killed in 1579, over the next 4 years, the Earl would count few victories. In a last-ditch effort to find peace, he would pen a letter to Queen Elizabeth from Abbeyfield, the village of my grandfather's birth, on April 28, 1583. But there would be no getting to yes for the Earl of Desmond. And as the clock ticked down to the correct astronomical time, Dee's recalculation of Rome's new Gregorian calendar by 11 days and 53 minutes, as opposed to the 10 days that Rome suggested, would bring the Masonic Day of Revenge in line exactly with the November 22nd papal bull that had ordered the arrest of the Knights Templar in 1307. According to numerous researchers, there were omens that something needed to be done to make sure the heavens pivoted in Elizabeth's favor. Louvre continues. 1583 would see another dramatic astrological event, a great conjunction between Saturn and Jupiter in the fiery trigon of Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius. This would be the 7th such conjunction that had occurred in history, one of which was during the birth of Christ. For Europe's astrologers, this fiery trigon indicated the end of the 960-year epoch of history, which presaged the end of the Roman Church. With a fugitive Earl of Desmond living a day-to-day existence, it's hard to believe the date of his execution was not being wagered on by his enemies in London. And it is even harder to believe that Cecil Lord Burleigh's letter calling for an urgent response to Dee's calendar because of a, quote, secret matter to be reformed before November isn't a reference to the date of Gerald's anticipated execution during the fiery trigon. Looking back to 1992, it's easy to see how my daughter's dream inspired us to piece together the history of the Fitzgerald family. But it wasn't until we brought the idea to Oliver Stone that we discovered the link to JFK through the British Empire's involvement in Afghanistan. The first clue came when we purchased a research book about the First Anglo-Afghan War and discovered a photograph of a British East India Company agent dressed in a plaid uniform with bell-bottom trousers and a matching turban. Our daughter wasn't surprised when I showed it to her at lunch. Yeah, that's the guy from my dream, she said, but he was younger and he didn't have a beard. The British East India Company had been founded under Queen Elizabeth I in 1600. Following John Dee's blueprint for global empire, the company would expand around the world, compete with Imperial Russia over Afghanistan, and be used by JFK's globalist Undersecretary of State, George Ball, as the model for a one-world government. One can see Dee's hand in the conquest of India and North America, but even more so in subsequent generations of geopolitical masters of the universe, from Halford Mackinder to FDR and his vice president, Henry Wallace, and later on to President Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski. More than any, Brzezinski embodied the idea of a quest for a universal vision and the creation of invisible control described in his 1970 book, Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technotronic Era, and reemphasized in his 1997 book, The Grand Chessboard. Brzezinski described America's empire as far British and far better than the British, Roman, and Chinese empires, in that, quote, its influence has an almost invisible quality through the interpenetration of economic institutions, sympathetic harmony of political leaders, shared concepts of sophisticated intellectuals like himself, and the mating of bureaucratic interests, and is something new in this world not yet understood. Brzezinski provided the same service for American empire in Afghanistan after getting into the Carter White House that John Dee had for Britain by overriding government checks and balances and restructuring covert action approval. Once approved, his process self-replicated invisibly throughout the system and then moved on to approve its own history and declare itself the winner. Brzezinski's system had worked so flawlessly and invisibly when in 1998 he boasted publicly that he had used his power to trick the Soviets into invading, there were howls from Dr. Charles Kogan, chief of the CIA's program to defeat the Soviets, that it just couldn't be true. But yet we personally had Charles Kogan tell us it was. It would take the American occupation of Afghanistan for Brzezinski to realize the magic he'd used to undo the Soviet Union was undoing the American empire he'd come to love. But despite presenting a more practical plan, the imperial mandate to restore the Golden Age and rebuild the Temple of King Solomon resurfaced to rule the day. When we set out for Soviet-occupied Afghanistan in 1981, I never imagined the foundations of imperialism to rest in a Platonic hierarchy handed down from the Romans. Much less did I realize the philosophical crisis within the West rested on a schism between two radically different factions of early Christians: St. Paul's non-Jewish Gentile converts and the Jews who believed Jesus to be the Messiah. This schism, perhaps more than anything, is represented in the internal tensions that propelled JFK to Dallas and the fulfillment of those end-time prophecies that resulted in his death on November 22nd, 1963. According to the old Saxon rules of sacred kingship, if one assumes Dee's cosmopolitical purpose was to sanctify Queen Elizabeth's rule over a new world order through the beheading of the Earl of Desmond at the fiery Trigon on November 22nd, 1583, then why not assume he was projecting the same sacrifice on the Sun King, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, at the end of the Great Year, which can be marked on the horizon in the skies over Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, 1963. And if that be the case, then why not assume the advent of artificial intelligence is merely the modern expression of John Dee's angelic intelligence and has been laying the mathematical foundation for rebuilding the Temple of Solomon for hundreds of years under the all-seeing eye. As described in the book City of Revelation by John Michel, the notion of the temple as the place of union between cosmic and terrestrial forces has been held by all people. To the Jews, however, has fallen the charge of preserving their living tradition into the present time, so that the image of the Temple of Jerusalem restored has become accepted in the language of symbolism as the consequent appearance of a revealed world order necessary for the reestablishment of human civilization. So in our opinion, if you possess the ability to create a mathematical model to steer humanity back to a mythical golden age through the sacred measurements of Solomon's temple, how then would you go about achieving it? Early on in my research, I noticed that certain names and numbers kept repeating themselves and turning up without any connection to what I was looking for. One such number was 117. According to BibleStudy.org, one possible meaning of the number 117 is from its prophetic link to Jesus and the layout of Scripture. The Song of Solomon, penned by King Solomon himself, contains 117 verses, and the first 3 books of the Bible have 117 chapters. But the original case that caught my attention was Cabell Room Hotel number 117, in which the kidnapped American ambassador Adolph Dubs was assassinated on Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1979. Dubs had been sent to Afghanistan by Carter's Secretary of State Cyrus Vance with the express mission to calm Soviet fears of American interference on their southern border and keep them from invading. Already aware of the ritual elements surrounding the November 22nd date as a Masonic day of revenge for the Knights Templar, we focused on the number 117 as a coded message. But given the crucial moment in time in which it played into Brzezinski's agenda, we're now open to the idea that room number 117 is a mathematical metaphor for Solomon's Temple and evidence of John Dee's magical system of geolocation to shape future political events through assassination by removing a final obstacle to a desired geopolitical outcome. Geolocation was exactly what Dr. John Dee was doing when he used Solomonic theurgic magic as an astral global positioning system to cast long-range horoscopes for Britain's imperial agenda and prophesy more accurately where and when the best opportunities might be found. The U.S. ambassador had complained to Secretary of State Cyrus Vance that Brzezinski's support for an Islamic holy war in Afghanistan was making his mission impossible, and his assassination in Room 117 ensured Brzezinski's aggressive anti-Soviet agenda would go unopposed. The Soviet invasion 10 months later resulted in a major shift in the Cold War, killing diplomacy while furthering the threat of nuclear war. In addition, it opened a Pandora's box of hostile objectives that have been waiting in the wings, and especially one that fulfilled a long-standing imperial agenda of opening the Middle East to American troops. Was the number 117 the externalization of a pre-existing cipher code that the uninitiated would not recognize even when the message was delivered? I want to draw your attention to a 1957 United Nations-based Lucis Trust book by Theosophist author Alice Bailey called The Externalization of the Hierarchy, in which she describes the hidden forces controlling world events and the timeline in which those forces would become visible. Published under the Trust's original name, the Lucifer Publishing Company, the book reveals that the final step in the externalization in 2025 would accompany the rebuilding of the temple and the return of the Messiah while initiating the rule of the, quote, Masonic movement as the custodian of the law, the home of the mysteries under the all-seeing eye. But was this New World Order really the fulfillment of revealed prophecy? Or was the Christianity of the Apostle Paul just a rebranding of a Roman imperial hierarchy rather than a Jewish Messiah bent on freeing his people from the oppression of just such an elite hierarchy? The level of hubris is noted by author Frances Yates in her book Astrea, the Imperial Theme in the 16th Century. Quote, the sanctification of the idea of empire was enhanced by the tradition of the providential role of Rome as a historical preparation for the birth of Christ. In consenting to be born into a world ruled by Roman law under the greatest of Caesars, Christ had consecrated the Roman world order and Roman justice. Virgil was believed to have spoken with the inspired voice of a prophet when he proclaimed that the Golden Age was about to return. In the 20th century alone, well-known theosophists Helena Blavatsky, William Butler Yeats, and FDR's Vice President Henry Wallace all put forward similar plans to bring forth the return of the Golden Age and evoke the New World Order described by Alice Bailey and the Lucifer Trust. But what of the message preached by the flesh and blood Jewish Messiah? According to author Jason Louv, that message came with a problem revealed in the Apocalypse of St. John and remains today as a terrifying shadow haunting the New Testament as Israel fights an apocalyptic war on 8 separate fronts. Louv writes, quote, Revelation originally described the end of the world as it was then known. It was written from the perspective of the Jews who had accepted Christ as the Jewish Messiah, not St. Paul's converts to the new religion of Christianity, drawn from the pagans of Greece, Rome, and Northern Africa. The book is a visionary prophecy of the final war of the much tormented Jewish followers of Christ against the evil of not only Nero's Rome, but also Paul's non-Jewish converts to Christianity. For us, this distinction between the original Jewish followers of Jesus and St. Paul's pagan converts to Christianity answered a lot of questions. And when we ran the idea up against the arrival of the Fitzgerald family to Ireland in 1170, the 1100th anniversary of the destruction of Jerusalem's Second Temple, we realized they'd found something in Celtic Christianity that set them on a different path from Rome's imperialism. To paraphrase from the book, Celtic Christianity, a Sacred Tradition of Vision and Hope by Benedictine Father Timothy Joyce. The Celtic Church developed in its own unique way. On the continent, many Celts had embraced Roman culture without resistance to Roman imperialism. But the planned Roman invasion of Ireland never took place. The Irish were never part of the Roman Empire. Some of the theological problems that beset Rome never affected the Celtic Church. St. Augustine had become from the Manichaeans, which held a dualistic view of reality, believing in a cosmic split of light and darkness. Material beings and their sexuality took on an aura of evil, which never entered the Celtic Church. This early church was influenced by the Eastern churches of both Jerusalem and Constantinople, which retained a strong connection to their Jewish roots. Through trade, there were direct contacts, and knowledge of the churches was widespread. And so with these words, I understood how the Fitzgeralds had come to be one with the Fitzgeralds of Ireland, and how the original message of the Jewish Messiah matched the Fitzgeralds' opposition to a sacred hierarchy in London that would see only itself as the salvation of humanity. To again quote from Yeats, "The destiny of mankind is at stake in the idea for which the Virgin Queen of the Golden Age stands. This is the sacred imperialism of the Prince of Peace, the Christian blend of Hebrew and Virgilian prophecy uttered by the Messiah in the universal peace of the Roman Empire." Given the underlying objective, the Crown would have seen the House of Desmond as the ultimate threat to their mission. But to see it restored in the 20th century under the presidency of JFK as the prophesied Prince of Peace would have triggered a need to destroy the Fitzgerald legacy once and for all, and especially JFK and his son John. According to John Michel, the destruction of Solomon's Temple is not, however, the end of the story. For part of its legend is set in the future. One day, it is said, the temple will be restored. The sacred order will again be established. The harmony between men and nature will once more prevail. That event, according to all prophecies, will take place in a period of extreme need and desperation. Its timing is beyond human control, but the human mind is presumably the medium through which its coming is made apparent. In an attempt to pull the nuclear gun away from America's head in 1983, we brought the world-renowned negotiator, Boston Brahmin, Mason, and chief of the Harvard Negotiation Project, Roger Fisher, to Afghanistan to talk the Soviet Union out of the greatest threat to peace since World War II. But like the Earl of Desmond's plea to Elizabeth I and JFK's effort to bring a lasting peace, there would be no getting to yes in Afghanistan. The sacred narrative of restoring the hierarchy of Solomon's Temple had bulldozed Roger's efforts to get a deal. And it wasn't the Soviets who'd said no, but Ronald Reagan's purveyors of sacred imperialism. It was this act of witnessing the dismissal of Roger's efforts at diplomacy by the US government and America's media through his eyes that propelled us away from journalism. But it was the desire to find an answer to the deeper mysteries of why it had to be made to fail that brought us to be here with you today. Thank you.